If you're walking around London, especially somewhere like Bloomsbury or Mayfair, there's one thing that's inescapable: railings. You find railings absolutely everywhere. You find them in front of all the little Victorian houses so that you don't fall down the servants' stairs. You find them around the parks in the middle of the squares. Sometimes they're even historically listed, like these ones in Claremont Square in Islington. And even when they're not, they make the place feel Victorian and fancy. Today I'm going to make my teenage self cringe and talk about how fascinating London's railings are. Our text for today is Matthew Ingleby's Bloomsbury Beyond the Establishment, which has a whole chapter on railings and is where I first found a lot of the sources that I'm going to show you.
Welcome to my beautiful garden. The two places best known for their railings, Bloomsbury and Mayfair, have a lot in common. Both of them were originally considered countryside outside London and have only been built on in the last few hundred years. Most buildings in both places are still 18th and 19th century, and they're both owned by dukes. Seriously, almost the whole of Bloomsbury is owned by the Duke of Bedford, and Mayfair by the Duke of Westminster. How did they get to own so much land? How can you replicate their success? In the words of the previous Duke of Westminster, make sure you have an ancestor who was a very close friend of William the Conqueror. Big swathes of both places got built all at once as basically an early modern housing estate. The dukes were like, how can I make the most money out of my swamp? And the answer was, build loads of identical rows of houses. What the answer is not, though, is sell the land off for a profit now that you've improved it. Instead, if you buy a house on the Duke of Bedford or the Duke of Westminster's land, you buy the house, but not the land the house is sitting on. You have what's called a leasehold. No one who lives in these houses owns the land their house is built on. Instead, they've bought a long lease to the property, and the landowner gets ultimate control over what gets built there. That's why, even though the people who live in these houses are sometimes very wealthy and could easily afford to remodel their entire house to their liking, the houses all look exactly the same because they haven't changed since they were built.
When Bloomsbury and Mayfair are being built, they don't build rows of endless terraces like you see in working class districts. Instead, they build squares of houses with an open space in the centre. Gardeners like Humphrey Repton are brought in to bring green space into London, which is quite a novel concept for the 18th century and a modern one. And what you end up with is gardens like the one here at Bedford Square. They have railings around the outside, and the gates are locked. If you want to get in, you need a key, and if you want a key, you have to lease one of the houses around here. Nice and simple.
Now, imagine that it's the 18th century, and you don't live in one of these houses, but in a working class terrace 2 streets down, or you're a servant in one of these houses and so you don't have the key, or your landlord is subletting one of these houses to you but hasn't given you the key. Before the late 19th century, it's actually really hard to find any kind of public space in London, especially green space. If you look at street maps from the period, it's just rows and rows of houses with no space reserved for parks. Parks don't make money. Even the big ones like Green Park, St James's Park and Hyde Park, they're all closed off with big brick walls 10 feet high around them and only open to key holders. You cannot get into a park without paying. So what do you do if you want to meet a gentleman friend? If you're a kid and you want to play outdoors? If you don't have public spaces where you're allowed to congregate, it actually has free speech implications, because where are you supposed to hold a protest? So you end up doing that stuff in the middle of the road, and nobody likes that.
In 1866, the Reform League, who were protesting for working class men to have the right to vote, were stopped from holding their meeting in Hyde Park, and so they tore the railings down to get in. And then someone drew this cartoon of sad policemen standing round the railings' grave.
And of course, an even more famous group of protesters uses railings in a very different way. The suffragettes. Suffragettes are really famous for chaining themselves to railings these days, although it wasn't what they were known for at the time. Maybe as a society, we're not really ready to talk about how many of these women went window smashing. In 1908, members of the Women's Freedom League go into the House of Commons and sit in the Ladies' Gallery. The public gallery used to be split into men's and ladies' sections, and the ladies' section had this big grille across the front that made it really hard to hear what was going on. The Women's Freedom League start dropping leaflets over the railing demanding the right to vote. And when the sergeant-at-arms goes up to kick them out, he finds that they've chained themselves to the grille and they have to wrench it off the wall to get them out. When you do this to railings outside, it has the same effect as protesters who glue themselves to the road today. It makes it harder for police or security guards to drag you off, so you can keep speaking for longer and get more attention on your cause. So people who are hoping for big changes in society notice the railings. In the 1890 book News from Nowhere by William Morris, the narrator wakes up one day in an actual socialist utopia London, and he notices that when he walks past the British Museum, which has massive railings around the front, that the building looks the same from the outside, except that the railings are gone. That's exactly what happens in real life during World War II, when all that tasty iron is needed for the war effort to make bombs and tanks and planes. Whoever at Pathé had the idea to send a cameraman out to capture the railings being removed, I could kiss you. What a great historical source.
Oh, these guys should really have welding masks. You know you can get lung cancer from welding Oh, never mind.
Without the railings, the squares are open to the public for the first time. The writer George Orwell, who is living and working around Bloomsbury during the war, says that many more green spaces were now open to the public, and you could stay in the parks till all hours instead of being hounded out by grim-faced keepers. As the war draws to a close, people start to ask whether they're going to be reinstated or left open. People have sacrificed an awful lot in the war. Even if they've not personally been sent to a war zone, they've been bombed, they've lost family members and friends, they might have had their kids evacuated away from them, and have lived under strict rationing rules for years. Now the war's over, people want to know that they did all this for a reason, that society is going to be better after the war than it was before it. Remember, what was before the war was the Great Depression, so people weren't anxious to go back to business as usual. But these days, almost all the squares have had their railings reinstated.
So what, you want to let people trample around in your garden? You want to abolish all private property? You want to let people share your toothbrush? As one writer to George Orwell puts it,
are the squares to which you refer public or private properties? If private, I suggest that your comments, in plain language, advocate nothing less than theft and should be classed as such. Let me show you.
Welcome to Russell Square! So this one is open to the public. Now the Duke still owns it. Don't worry, no one took his land away. But he made a deal with the council. Don't worry, the deal was voluntary, no one made him do this. The deal is that he opens it up to the public and in return the council pays for the upkeep. So they're the ones that take the bins out and do the gardening and pick up the litter. And look how much more pleasure is got out of this square. School groups can come and sit and eat their lunches here when they're on the way to the British Museum. Workers can come and eat their lunches here, students can have parties, dogs get walked, kids play ball games, tired people can sit down for 5 minutes. people can meet and have ideas and socialise and pass those ideas on and make plans. They even have a cafe here. The worst thing about key gardens is that they're not even a good substitute for private gardens, right? You're still sharing them with everybody else in your square. So it's not like you can sunbathe topless or hang your washing out. They're often surrounded by big trees and high hedges, so you probably can't keep an eye on your kid from the window while they play in the square. And in Bedford Square, you're not even allowed to walk your dog or have a ball game in the garden that you pay for. Are the people who live in Russell Square having a garden taken away from them? No, they never had a private garden in the first place. They can still do all the things that they could do before in here, except now everybody gets to enjoy it. The cost is spread out over a much wider group of people, so rather than just the people around the square paying for the upkeep through their leases, now everyone in the borough pays for it through their council tax. Because it's open to the public, people take more pride in it, so they don't chuck their rubbish over the fence like they do in the private key gardens. And local businesses actually want to sponsor insect hotels and lampposts here because they might get seen. There's a group of volunteers called the Friends of Russell Square that do a lot of the planting. And that's not something you find in the private key gardens. And there are dogs here. Isn't this better? Isn't this better?
If giving the land of England back to the people of England is theft, I'm quite happy to call it theft. In his zeal to defend private property, my correspondent does not stop to consider how the so-called owners of the land got hold of it. They simply seized it by force, afterwards hiring lawyers to provide them with title deeds. It is desirable that people should own their own dwelling houses, and it's probably desirable that a farmer should own as much land as he can actually farm. But the ground landlord in a town area has no function. He causes rents to be higher, he makes town planning more difficult, and he excludes children from green spaces. That is literally all that he does, except to draw his income. For 3 years or so, the squares lay open and their sacred turf was trodden by the feet of working class children, a sight to make dividend drawers gnash their false teeth. If that is theft, all I can say is, so much the better for theft.